Hello students. Hello ma'am. So here we are today to discuss about the different types of yarns, because we require this study to understand how they behave in a fabric, because their characteristics are different, their performance is different, because they have been constructed differently by the different manufacturers. So as you know, we know different types of fibers are available, the short length fibers, the long length fibers called the staple and the filament. So both these fibers, when they are spun into the yarn, the characteristics would differ, and based on the characteristics, when a fabric is woven from these yarns, naturally the fabric characteristics also would depend upon these characteristics. So there are different types of yarns, like the classification where we have the staple and the longitudinal one, and then we have another classification based on their size, because as you all know, we think of size only in terms of weight. But here the yarn size would refer to the size of the yarn, that is the thinness and the thickness of the yarn as well. And so based on the thinness and the thickness, the fabric weight would differ, and so the many characteristics that are dependent upon this thickness of the fabric also would differ along with the yarn content in it. So today we will study about how the yarns can be classified, what is their role in the fabric, how you can identify in fact what is a yarn that is most suitable for different types of construction, and how the characteristics of the yarn would play a role in the fabric characteristics as well. So to deal with, we will study about a little history of how the yarns have been developed and how they have come into existence and all this. But the only possible thing is a little information that is available from the artifacts, because as you know, textile materials are biodegradable. That means once they are put into the mud, they are degraded very fast, and so we do not have much of the past evidence which gives us an idea of when, how and where it has started. But there was a little evidence saying that around 25,000 years ago, there were some skirts made out of yarns directly, which was used by the people of that period. So this little evidence would tell us that yarns were made by the people during that period of time. So also making of yarn was such a tedious one during those periods of time, because there was no small gadgets that we are having right now, nor even a charka that people use to make the yarn. So the only possible thing was using their hands. So when they were using their hands, they would take a tuft of cotton into one hand and then spin out a little fiber from that, and then turn or twist the fingers in such a way that would form into a continuous yarn. But it was not called as a yarn, it was called as a twisted fiber, because yarn requires some sort of twist into that. So this fiber was available, and it was a tedious process, and it was taking quite a long time. And then we had another process called the takli process, where the takli was used, which would spin and then make a twist into the yarn. And later on, they say that the evidence say that charka was first founded in India, and you know Mahatma Gandhi always sitting in front of the charka and doing his work. So this charka was supposed to be an invention by India around 500 BC. So after the charka has been invented, we could find that the amount of yarn that was produced was quite good enough. Also the speeding up was quite easy for the people. And so this is a little history which deals about how the yarns came. So we all know that much evidence is not given here for us, but still the little evidence shows us definitely there is a point of time where yarns were made long back. So this shows about the how the yarns have come into the existence. we have just dealt with the history of the yarns, and coming to the definition, what is actually a yarn? How do you define it? So, there are many definitions given for the yarn, and one of the definition is it is a strand of textile fibers which is made suitable either for weaving purpose or for knitting purpose or for any other purpose. So, that means the fibers are made into a strong strand called as the yarn. So, that would be the definition given by the ASTM. So, according to them, that means the fibers are twisted to form into a yarn, and this yarn can be of a different classification, as I told you earlier, because we have classes based on the length of the fiber that is being used for the making of yarn, based on the number of parts that are present in the yarn, and there are many other methods, like as the twist is given, what type of twist is given. So, this would also decide on the type of twist that is given, we can classify them as well, and also based on the amount of twist that a yarn is given. So, we have yarn twist ranging from very low to very high depending on the end use. So, based on that also we can classify the yarns that are present. Now, let us go in detail about each type of classification. First, let us deal with the classification based on the length of fibers that are present in the yarn. So, as you all know, we know that all the cellulosic fibers or the natural fibers in general are shorter lengths that are available, and so they are called as staple fibers. So, when these staple fibers are spun into a yarn, automatically we get a yarn called as staple yarn. So, a staple yarn contains all the short fibers that can be made into a yarn, and to make a yarn there is a certain characteristic that is required for a fiber. This does not mean that any fiber available in the nature can be spun into a yarn. No, it is not possible, because it should have a property called cohesiveness. You all have studied what is cohesiveness. So, it is the clinging power of the fibers. So, when fibers can cling well enough, then you can get a very good yarn out of that. When they do not have a clinging power, the yarn cannot be made. In fact, the fibers would open out very easily and the yarn does not have any strength. So, this is one of the characteristics that is required for making a yarn. So, fibers having good cohesiveness can be made into a yarn very easily, and also these yarn characteristics, as I told you, is dependent upon all this length, because short length fibers generally are shorter enough, and the strength of the fibers also varies from plant to plant if it is a natural fiber or cellulosic fiber, or from animal to animal if it is a animal hair fiber, or silk is also one of the animal fibers. So, each fiber has a different strength, which also is combined when a yarn is made. So, the natural characteristic present in the fiber is as well carried into the yarn also. So, when we divide the yarns into spun yarns and filament yarns, that is the yarns that is made from short staple and the yarns made from long, we have different yarns that comes out, because they have a special characteristic, especially the spun yarns, because they are short fibers. When you make a yarn, the short fiber ends still keep protruding out from the fiber, which are very visible even with the naked eye. So, when you see a cotton fabric, you can as well see a fuzzy nature on the surface sometimes. So, that is because of the short stapleness. And in fact, the short staple is also very important where there is a lot of humidity, and especially on a hot humid climatic condition. When you wear a fabric of having a short staple or the staple yarn, these short staples which are protruding out of the yarn would make the fabric stand a little away from the body, thereby making the wearer very comfortable, because when the fabric sticks onto the body, you feel very uncomfortable. So, these short staples are the something which add a lot of comfortness, especially on the humid days. And so, polyester fibers, as we know, are also a synthetic fiber which do not have good absorbency, but they can be spun on the short staple length, so that you can make a polyester fiber also similar to that of cotton fiber, and so it has almost a similar characteristics like that of cotton. But there is a little problem with the short staple length, where these protruding ends would rub off when it is made into a fabric, or they would ball up like small pills on the surface. This is especially evident when we see the polyester fabrics, where a polyester and a cotton is being mixed up, especially in the uniform fabrics. So, this balling up is a very evident characteristic of especially the staple length, but otherwise they are good comfort enough. And also there is a lot of shedding. Shedding means because the short staple, as they rub off, they come out of the yarn, they loosen out of the yarn and they drop out, that we call it as lint. So, the lint shedding is quite high in case of staple length yarns. And also the coverage, we say that the coverage is the amount of space it occupies. So, if we take 10 yarns of staple length and 10 yarns of filament fiber, and we keep them together on a specific, say 1 inch wide surface, then you can see the low number of yarns are required, where they cover up very easily with a spun yarn, whereas you require more yarns from the filament yarns to cover up the same space. So, we call this as cover factor. So, this cover factor is very important, and this cover factor is good enough for the staple length of fibers. So, that is how we have different staple length fibers, which is actually cotton is one good example where we take when we are talking about how a spun yarn is being made, where the mechanical process of opening, carding, combing, you must have studied all this. So, all these processes would finally lead into a yarn that is a staple length yarn. So, this is what the staple length is, and wherever we require a comfort and wherever you want a fabric to have a cotton feel, even the synthetics can be spun on this method, so that you get a yarn that is similar to that of cotton. It is not 100% replacement for cotton, but still the characteristics to some extent you have a yarn similar to that of a cotton yarn. So, coming to the filament yarns, as I told you, the filament yarns are almost the synthetic fibers. That means all the polyester, nylon, all these are synthetic fibers, man-made fibers, and we have only one fiber called as the natural filament fiber, that is the silk fiber. So, except silk, all other filament fibers are from the artificial origin or the man-made fibers. And so, these fibers do also have a different characteristics, because they are obtained from the spinneret in the form of long fibers. So, it depends upon the manufacturing process of how much of length you require for these fibers, except silk. So, these fibers, because they come out from the spinneret, they are very smooth, very even, very lustrous in fact, because they are made from all the chemicals. And so, the amount of luster that is required also can be altered in the manufacturing process, thereby making them a little dull using some delustering agent. And also because they are very, very smooth enough, what happens is the smoothness of these fibers will not allow, because they do not have any short staple fibers that are present on the surface, they will not shed the lint nor pill as like that of a short staple yarn. That is because they do not have the short fibers on the surface. And as I told you, the cover factor is low for these filament yarns, and all the smooth yarns may not give you a very good comfort, because on the same humid day, if we consider a synthetic fabric and a cotton fabric, we can see that we will be more comfortable if we are using only a cotton fabric and not a synthetic. And so, to make it appear, one way is to make them into a staple length and then process them as a staple yarn. and the other way is where you can give a texture to the yarn surface. We call them as textured yarns, where purposefully there are some coils, curls introduced into the yarn, so that they have more bulkiness and they also add interest to the fabrics also. So, we have continuous filament yarns, and also we have filament yarns which are smooth and very lustrous. So, all the characteristics that are disadvantages in the staple fibers becomes the advantages in the filament fiber, because their soiling is very heavy in staple fibers, staple yarn, whereas in filament yarns the soiling character is very low. You know, polyester is very easy to wash, you can use it very easily, you simply wash it, we call that as dip dry also. In fact, we had those finishes where you dip the fabric and dry the fabric, you do not need to iron it as well. So, caring for fabric synthetic is much easier than caring for a cotton fabric, or we call it a fiber or the fabric made from the staple yarns. So, with these characteristics we can say that the filament yarns are both continuous filament yarns and textured filament yarns and staple yarns. So, based on the length of fiber we have, we can segregate them into two classes basically, and this is what is about how based on the length of the fiber they are called as spun, what are the characteristics, how they perform, and what is the characteristics of the filament yarns as well. Now, there is another classification where we can say that the yarns can be classified based on the number of parts it contains. So, when you take a sewing thread for example, when you are threading a needle especially, you find a problem where one part would go into the needle eye and the other part would remain. So, if you try to remove, you can see two parts actually present in a yarn. So, that means that this particular yarn contains two parts. So, it is, that means the classification of yarns can also be based on the number of parts it contains. So, a single yarn is something, the first class, where we can see that when fibers are twisted together to form a yarn, then we call it as a single yarn or a simple yarn. So, when two such simple yarns are used together and then twisted again, like I told you the example of sewing thread. So, then it forms a ply yarn, and based on the number of ply, actually ply yarn is supposed to be the second twisting operation we have, and we have a third operation where ply yarns combine together make a cord. Take for example, where you see the line where we dry our clothes, you have a polyester line, the rope like thing, even a cotton rope also when you see, when you try to open, it works out to be many parts contained into it. So, a cord yarn is supposed to be a yarn that is a result of the third twisting operation. A ply yarn is a yarn that is available after the second twisting operation, where two or more singles can be combined together and twisted together. A sewing thread which you see is a 2-ply yarn. Actually, 2-ply yarns are mostly used in the weaving, where the strength of the yarn is also taken care and also the amount of twist is taken care. The same yarn can be given more twist, which can be used for sewing purpose. It can be given a low twist where it can be used for some other purpose. So, before the fabric manufacture starts, the yarns are decided where which amount of twist has to be given, whether it has to be a single yarn, a ply yarn or a cord yarn. And one thing we have to remember is never a cord yarn is used in apparel. That means, the clothing which we use for making dresses and all, we generally do not use a corded yarn, that is the third twisting operation. Only we restrict ourselves to ply yarns. So, a ply yarn can be used in fishing nets, the fishing nets also do have a yarn. There also you find this. Sewing threads also you will see, and we can also see the yarn that is present even where they use the tarpaulin stitching, industrial materials, industrial cords, and all this we see lot many materials that are used by either ply yarns or cords in fact, which require more, it is more sturdy, because a single yarn, as you know, when you pull it out you can open it out very easily. A ply yarn is quite difficult. There are certain sewing threads where you can break them very easily. There are certain sewing threads which are very difficult to break in fact. So, all this will depend upon the amount of twist and the type of fiber also that goes into that particular yarn. So, we have a ply yarn which is based on 2 plies or 3 ply or even a 4 ply. That means, 2 singles will make a ply, and 2 such ply yarns when they are used together in twisting, we call it as 2 ply. When more than 3 ply yarns are used, we call 3 ply. 5 ply, multiply, you have ply yarns also of various parts that are present, and when these ply yarns together are combined with another ply yarn, then the cord results. There is a difference between ply yarn and a cord yarn as well. So, the restriction is that cord yarns are seldom used in our apparel fabrics, whereas ply yarns and single yarns are used for various purposes in the apparel fabrics. So far we have seen the classification, 2 types of classification, one based on the length of fiber it contains and the other based on the number of parts it contains. Now, depending upon the similarity that is present in the yarn, you can also classify them. That means, when the yarns that are very similar in one particular yarn, that means, when it is a ply yarn, when 2 singles are of the same nature, say for example, they are smooth, they are long enough, they are of the same size, then we call it as similarity. When in a ply yarn, there is one yarn which is very thin, the other is very thick enough, and when we try to combine these 2 yarns, then we do not call it as a similarity, because they are dissimilar. So, that comes under a different classification. So, under the parts which are very similar to each other, we can say that all these ply yarns, single yarns, corded yarns, everything would come under all the yarns that are very similar in nature, because no ply yarn is made purposefully except for some texture defects, because texture is something which is felt when you pass your hand on the surface. So, for this texture effects, purposefully they use different types of yarns and different combination of yarns to get that texture. But otherwise, ply yarns which are used for weaving especially, which are used in the warp yarn, that is a fabric do have a warp and a web. So, in the warp yarn always we should use a yarn that is smoother enough and very even. Uneven type of yarn or dissimilar type of a yarn can be used in the weft, but not in the warp, because they are stretched from one end to the other end on the loom as well. So, coming to the dissimilar type of yarns, we call them as fancy yarns or textured yarns. Fancy yarns, as the name implies, they are only done for the purpose of creating some interest on the surface. If you have seen a tweed fabric, it is a woolen fabric, a tweed fabric, where you can see on the surface different colored specks here and there. It is not similar in nature. So, in that what happens is, they prepare a yarn which contains those colored yarns present, and then that is woven into a fabric, whereby the fabric that is obtained will give us a effect called the tweed effect. In fact, the effect itself is called a tweed effect. So, the textured yarns or the fancy yarns are purposefully made by introducing irregularities in the yarn at regular intervals. They are not at irregular intervals. Say for every 1 centimeter, they introduce a color yarn in a original yarn. When fiber is introduced here and there, tufts of fiber, then you get another yarn called as a flock yarn. So, the amount and the spacing is maintained even in a textured yarn. So, we say purposefully they make irregularities on a regular basis, that is a textured yarn. So, in textured yarns we have various varieties where we have a ply yarn that can be textured, we have a cord yarn that can be textured, we have a simple yarn also that can be textured. So, it can be a staple yarn that can be textured, it can be a filament yarn that can be textured. So, anything can be made into a fancy yarn, but one has to remember that it is done to create only an effect on the surface, and so what you need to do is you cannot use them when you are weaving in the warp direction of the fabric. They have to be only in the weft direction of the fabric. So, each of these fabric would give a different effect based on the type of the yarn that is present in that particular fabric as well. So, we can classify them based on the similarity or the dissimilarity present in them. So, we call that as simple yarns or the similarity of the yarn, and the second category we call them as novelty yarns. So, that is about the yarn, its types, its classification, and how they behave when a fabric is woven from these types of yarns.